When people think of cross, the first country that springs to mind is usually Belgium. The fans, the courses, the history. But who comes next? Some might say France, arguably the inventors, the winners of the first rainbow jerseys. Or maybe the Dutch, arguably the dominant nation across men's and women's cross right now. But I think it might be neither of them. In fact, to me it's a country that has a mere 3 World Cup victories to its name. None of them have come this century. But nonetheless, I think that the Swiss might well be the second nation of cyclocross. And I think a lot of that statue rests on the shoulders of a single man, Albert Zweifel. Albert Zweifel came into our world on the 7th of June 1949 in the Swiss town of Ruti in the canton of Zurich, and more interestingly in the Swiss cyclocross Holy Lands, nestled just between Eschenbach and Wetzikon, some of the finest crosses that the Swiss put on. Albert would grow up initially as a car mechanic, but he always had a heart for cross, even getting kicked out of school in his final year, having decided instead to attend a 3-day cyclocross boot camp in Merglingen, some 150 kilometres away. How and where Albert got into racing is a bit of a mystery. The oldest result I've found anywhere on the internet dates from 1968, when a 19-year-old Zweifel took part in that year's Amateur Cyclocross World Championships in Kirchberg, Luxembourg. Roger de Vlaeminck would be the winner of that race. Peter Frischknecht, a fellow Swiss, would be second. Albert would finish in 23rd place, near the back of the 29 starters. This wasn't the most invigorating debut, though it would be better than the year after, when he wouldn't even take to the start line. By 1970 though, he was back for another crack at the Amateur Worlds, finishing 20th. He'd have greater success on the domestic scene though. In Merglingen he'd take his first career victory, as far as I've been able to source. Eventually Albert would start to notice something though, potentially explaining his poorer performances on the international scene. When he finished training, he would go drinking and play cards with his teammates Hermann Gretner and Peter Frischknecht. He noticed that, for example, the de Vlaeminck brothers were taking the sport slightly more seriously, having the knock-on effect of them being considerably fitter. From that moment on, Albert would seriously change his training regime, becoming, if anything, a nutritionary expert in cyclocross, helping professionalise not just himself, but Frischknecht and Gretner too. By 1973, his training would pay off, achieving a best amateur performance at the Cross Worlds by finishing 5th in that year's race in London, a performance that would earn himself a professional contract with the French Sonolor team, affording him the ability to race on the road too. This would include a debut at the Dauphiné and an appearance in his home race of the Tour de Suisse, where he'd even manage a decent 13th place finish. Wrapping up a solid road debut season with a less solid DNF at the Road Worlds, Zweifel dived back into cross, almost literally in fact, preferring courses to be as heavy and difficult as possible, with big mud baths abound. With this newfound professional backing, Zweifel would debut the Elite World Championships held in Vera de Bidasoa in Spain. As the elder statesman of power and mud, Berten van Damme, took his only world title, Zweifel placed a respectable 10th, now being solidly in the mix domestically, but not yet a winner, and showing some signs of pedigree internationally. The goal was to level up, and so that's exactly what he did. Before crowning himself as the Swiss cross king, Albert Zweifel did something else that not many crossers have ever actually done. A weirdly small amount have, in fact. He rode the Giro d'Italia. Unfortunately, Albert Zweifel's attempt at the Giro was utterly devoid of any interesting takeaways. He finished 88th, almost 3 hours behind Eddy Merckx, who won. He didn't do much on any of the stages, and even his team didn't really achieve much. His only teammate to finish the race was Giancarlo Tattoni, who finished 93rd. But he did ride it, And with the Giro coming to its head this weekend, it is quite a fun little thing to know. Back in the relevant discipline to Zweifel's career though, things were taking a bit of an upswing. Over the winter he'd win some 8 times, including classics like Steinmauer, foreign races like Münster, and the grand rehearsal for the World Championships in Melchnau. When the real World Championships rolled around, Zweifel was a solid outsider. The favourites of course would be the de Vlaeminck brothers and their rival Albert van Damme, but the Swiss were hot on their heels. The story is well known. The de Vlaeminck's had hatched a plan to seal Eric an 8th world title, but that went up in smoke instantly as Roger crashed at turn 1, and then Eric just attacked for no apparent reason. By lap 2 the de Vlaeminck's had somehow risen and fallen back together. Perhaps the gravitational pull of their egos had dragged them back towards each other, as Albert van Damme and Albert Zweifel joined them along for the ride. As Roger made an attack nobody had an answer to, not even Eric, despite that being the plan they'd initially concocted. Several laps later and a short search by Eric de Vlaeminck for his dentures that fell out, yes, really, Albert Zweifel could count himself as a cyclocross World Championships podium finisher, becoming the 4th Swiss to take a cyclocross silver medal, the first in 7 years, only just failing to do something the Swiss had never done, taking the actual cyclocross world title. In preparation for his attempt to go one better and become the first Swiss world champion, Zweifel would ride the Tour de Suisse for the 3rd consecutive year. He'd also gone a frankly ridiculous run during the cross season, podiuming everywhere he went, bar a 5th place in the Belgian Heusden. This included a victory at the Swiss National Championships, giving Albert his first national title, and mere weeks later the Worlds took place in Chazé-d'Azergues in France. Zweifel had been the man of the season so far, and with the de Vlaeminck brothers seemingly both AWOL for varying reasons, he was the big favourite, and he would deliver effortlessly. Lap by lap he'd shed more weight from his wheel, the last being teammate Peter Frischknecht, who got dropped with some 3 laps to go. With the victory margin of some 90 seconds, Albert Zweifel was the very first Swiss cyclocross world champion, and with Frischknecht in 2nd, they had a 1-2 on their hands as well. With the world title in his pocket, Zweifel would embark on his 4th attempt at the Tour de Suisse, but this attempt at the race would go slightly differently to the ones before. Albert was on good form throughout the race, claiming top 10s on stages 3 and 4 and being in contention to win the whole race. However, on the 6th stage, a mountainous endeavour including ascents of the Gotthard and Furka passes, on the descent of the Furka pass, whilst running through a feed zone, Zweifel would collide heavily with a soigneur. In Zweifel's own retelling of the story, the soigneur was knocked unconscious and understandably in need of medical attention. However, this left Zweifel somewhat unchecked and he headed on his way, completing the last 25 kilometres of the stage and seemingly still finishing in the top 10. Stories vary from this point on. Some say Albert asked how much time he'd lost on the day before promptly collapsing and being rushed to hospital. Zweifel himself claims to have taken a shower and calmed down before heading to the hospital for a checkup. Nonetheless, the diagnosis at the hospital shocked all. In the crash he had fractured his skull. There were questions whether he could even continue his career. Zweifel, however, had one bit of luck on his side during this whole incident. It was the 70s and therefore safety was a mild suggestion, and he could continue his career pretty much instantaneously. And so that winter Albert Zweifel lined up in the crossfields once more, ready to race again. And you wouldn't notice that summer he'd almost died. Once more Zweifel swept his competition, dominating the biggest Swiss races and winning regularly abroad as well. Having swept another Swiss title, Zweifel headed to the World Championships course in Hanover, where he would cross paths with the undisputed king of cross, Eric de Vlaeminck, a rival who was not to be underestimated. He may not have been at his peak anymore, but at a World Championships where Eric raced, only 3 people had ever become world champion. His brother Roger managed it once, Italy's 4-time world champion Renato Longo managed it twice early in Eric's career, and then of course Eric himself won 7 world titles. an amount not even remotely rivalled by anybody else. As the race started, de Vlaeminck and Zweifel found themselves heading the race, along with Peter Frischknecht and Germany's Klaus-Peter Thaler. With the pace eventually being too high for a still young Thaler, he'd fall away, leaving de Vlaeminck in a Swiss sandwich. After an untimely mechanical for the Belgian, Zweifel would strike, storming off the front, never to be seen again. Frischknecht would finish second, and Eric de Vlaeminck in third, his first ever world's medal that was not gold. Zweifel, meanwhile, became a two-time world champion. In June of that year, Zweifel would make his return on the road and make his return to the Tour de Suisse. Over the 10 stages, he would finish in the top 10 every single time, finishing in a career best 6th place overall. His greatest road season yet, being a great preparation for another dominant season in cross, a season including an incredible triple header of victories, winning 3 days in a row throughout New Year's of 1978, proving that he was in good form for some 20 days later, when again a world title was up for grabs. In Amorebieta in Spain, Zweifel was again looking towards Peter Frischknecht as his big rival, Thaler being the one to rival the two Swiss. The three would find themselves off the front quite quickly into proceedings, with another Swiss, the youngster Willi Lienhard. Lienhard and Thaler doing well to follow the other two, but eventually getting dropped, leaving once more just Frischknecht and Zweifel to battle out a world title. It was twice that Frischknecht had been beaten by his compatriot, and when Zweifel launched a devastating attack on the penultimate lap, that would become 3. 3 seconds for Frischknecht, 3 world titles for Albert Zweifel, leaving just Eric de Vlaeminck, André Dufresne and Renato Longo ahead of him, standing alongside Rolf Wolfshol and Roger Rondeau. Albert was now placing himself as true cross royalty, but he was far from done yet. Now a triple world champion, Zweifel would go through his traditional Tour de Suisse flavoured summer programme before heading back into the fields to dominate once more as the Swiss truly entered their golden age in cross. Alongside Zweifel there was Frischknecht, Willi and Erwin Lienhard and Gilles Blazer. They'd take the fight right up to the Belgians. In 1979, this fight would happen in the Italian village of Saccolongo. And in Saccolongo, the rain had come down and it had drowned almost the entire course. This was barely a cross anymore, it was a cross-country running race, and that suited Zweifel. And so it was that only a lap into the race, Zweifel attacked, with only Frischknecht even remotely able to follow. And whilst I could try and spin it into some amazing battle, it really wasn't. Zweifel was absolutely dominant. With Frischknecht eventually leaving the race with an ankle sprain, Albert Zweifel would dominantly win a 4th world title, over 4 minutes clear of Gilles Blazer in second. The only other riders to finish within 10 minutes were 3rd placed Robert Vermeire and 4th placed Jan Teugels, both from Belgium. And so, Albert Zweifel was a 4-time world champion, and with 4 titles in a row, a feat only few others had achieved. André Dufresne, Eric de Vlaeminck and Marianne Vos. That's it. At the peak of his powers, Albert was already looking for title number 5, and the 1980 World Championships were going to be hosted in Wetzikon, mere minutes from Zweifel's place of birth. A huge opportunity for Albert to win on home soil, to win a 5th world title on home soil. Coming into Wetzikon at the 1980 World Championships, Zweifel was the hot favourite, but alongside Peter Frischknecht and Klaus-Peter Thaler, he had a new generation of rivals to worry about. 2 youngsters from the Low Countries were stepping up their game, Dutchman Henny Stamsnijder and Belgium's 1978 amateur world champion Roland Liboton. In Wetzikon, famed for its difficult off-camber descent, it had been snowing, the ground was frozen over, but starting to thaw, and it had created an incredibly technical and sketchy circuit. And while Zweifel was the big man, believing in himself, he was seemingly unnerved by the conditions. As the race started, the young and fearless Liboton launched into the course, Zweifel trying to match him and taking the lead on the descent. However, he would arguably take too much risk, coming down multiple times. The first time he'd recover to rejoin Thaler, Stamsneider and Liboton at the front of the race. But after his second shunt, Liboton would bolt. The Swiss would never have a chance at recovery. In his home, minutes from his place of birth, on what was supposed to be his big day, he'd been bested by a kid, someone who'd never even made the top 10 before, and he wouldn't even take second or third as Thaler and Stamsneider managed to seal the podium. Zweifel missing the podium completely, missing out on 5 in a row, missing out on a 5th world title. It's a hammer blow to Albert, and it could well have seen him crumble, but he was desperate not to let that happen. The rivalry between Zweifel and Liboton would start to grow, over the years becoming increasingly bitter, at least from the point of view of Liboton. Liboton has told stories over the years of the two sharing smack talk and regularly trying their very best to deny each other victories, though Liboton seems to have a far larger hatred of Zweifel than in the reverse. Whichever way you look at it, the two would spend the entire next year smashing each other race after race, sharing the majority of victories out between themselves, before heading to Tolosa for another world title bout. Coming into Tolosa, Liboton and Stamsneider had made a pact. Whichever of the two attacked, the other would not follow and would force Zweifel to be the one to do the chasing. So when early in the race Stamsneider found himself with a gap, that's exactly what happened. Liboton sat on, forcing Zweifel to ride for the two, and try as the Swiss might, the Dutchman would be too strong. Stamsneider would become world champion, the first Dutch person to do so in fact. Liboton would take second, and Zweifel would end up in third place. Noticing he would need to change his approach to beat the two youngsters, that season he would make his debut in the Tour de France, hoping that would offer him an edge. However, it wouldn't do a whole lot, and at that year's World Championships in Lanarvilly, Zweifel would have to submit to Liboton in the sprint, and 12 months later in Birmingham, he would suffer pretty much the same fate again. Zweifel would that year also make his debut in the newly formed Super Prestige, finishing 7th in his debut in Zillebeke and taking a first podium in the competition in Gavre in that same season. Throughout the next season, Zweifel would continue to pick up podiums across the Super Prestige and the World Championships, with another bronze medal being the result of a 3-way sprint in Os between himself, Stamsneider and Liboton. The Belgian would take his 4th world title, drawing himself level with Albert Zweifel. And it was beginning to look like Zweifel's career might be starting to come to a close. He was now in his mid-30s, Liboton still in his late 20s. It looked like the Belgian might surpass the Swiss legacy. But the king of the mud, Albert Zweifel himself, had one last trick up his sleeve. In 1986, the World Championships headed towards Belgium, held in the town of Lembeek, and the venue was causing quite some commotion. Rain had been pouring for the past 2 weeks, and the course was completely awash. It was so bad that reigning world champion Klaus-Peter Thaler even refused to start, calling the circuit unworthy of hosting the Worlds. Amongst the riders who would start were Liboton, the heavy favourite despite his mishap the year prior costing him a world title. Stamsneider was at the start as well, and so was Rein Groenendaal. Zweifel himself was seen as maybe a podium candidate, an outsider, but in conditions that suited him perfectly, he truly came back to life. Dashing away early in the race with fellow Swiss youngster Pascal Richard, some 15 years his junior, the only man to follow. A handful of laps later, Richard would have to give in to the relentless pace Zweifel was setting, and so the self-proclaimed King of Mud, at 36 years of age, 7 years after his last world title, finally became a 5-time cyclocross world champion, a feat reserved only for the very, very best. Standing now alongside Longo and Dufresne, behind only de Vlaeminck and, crucially for Albert, one clear of Roland Liboton, who had failed to finish this race and would never achieve another world title. In his last years as a pro, Zweifel would remain consistent, shining on the courses that suited him most and generally being good for podiums and top tens across the seasons. Albert raced his first World Championships in Luxembourg in 1968, during the era of de Vlaeminck and Van Damme. He'd made his own era, battled through that of Liboton and Stamsnijder, and in 1988, aged 40, he would embark on his final World Championships in Pontchâteau. The Pontchâteau Worlds are famous for one, Denny de Bie, becoming the first rider to successfully jump the barriers on course. When the race started, Zweifel would come down in a large crash early on, having to abandon, and this crash to some extent symbolised the end of the stamina-heavy mud lovers, the power riders like Albert Zweifel. That old age of cross was starting to die out, and we were heralding a new type of cyclocross, the one that we know today, with flair and technique, and their ability as a bike rider more important than their stamina or power. His time was now over, but for 20 years Albert Zweifel had been amongst the greatest crossers in the world, and that deserves to be remembered. By the end of 1989, Albert retired, racing the odd mountain bike competition to keep his shape. He'd spend most of his time on the island of Mallorca, organising cycling holidays for tourists, a job he'd do until 2014. Now in his early 70s, Zweifel has returned to his native Switzerland to retire there. Throughout his 20-year career, Zweifel would win consistently. The most complete palmarès I've been able to find states 89 career victories, an impressive amount. Albert predates the majority of the biggest cross competitions. In his later years he plucked a handful of super prestige podiums. This was during the first editions of the competition, but he never actually won a super prestige race. Albert did of course win 5 world titles, an amount that puts him alongside Italy's Renato Longo and Frenchman Adrie Dufresne as second on the all-time list of world titles. Zweifel also has a record 9 Swiss titles to his name, including 7 consecutive victories in the early 80s. Another interesting fact about Albert Zweifel is that he holds the record for the most appearances in the Tour de Suisse, with a very impressive 16 participations. It seems like the name Albert implies an extraordinary ability in the harshest, muddiest conditions. Albert van Damme regularly being praised for his ability in those conditions, but Albert Zweifel blew even him out of the water. Zweifel lived for the mud, the harsher conditions, suiting his abilities fully. He was never the most talented cyclist, but his meticulous preparation and training, including constant searches for new tech and pushing the rules for what was allowed, really set him apart as a cyclist. I find it really difficult to find a good, suitable modern day comparison to Zweifel. He's this weird, elusive rider. He excels in heavy, muddy conditions despite being quite small and quite light, especially compared to the riders that suit those conditions usually. He was also good at running. He was not really a physical powerhouse, his numbers won't have been high, but something about slow speed allowed him to create an extraordinary amount of power. It's a really bizarre thing and I can't think of anyone who really fits it. The closest I can get is the American Clara Honsinger, but obviously Zweifel's palmarès is considerably larger than that of the American. It was just 2 weeks ago that I labelled Albert van Damme as the most underrated crosser of all time, and 2 weeks before that I also considered naming Hanke Koefenagel that. And again this week I'm considering stating that Albert Zweifel is actually the man most left out of conversations he absolutely belongs in. With 9 national titles, 5 world titles and countless individual victories, Albert is amongst the most decorated crossers in history. He is undoubtedly the greatest Swiss of all time, and is certainly high on the cyclocross folklore pantheon. Exactly where he ranks, I'll leave up to you, but I think he is one of the most sympathetic and most brilliant crossers in this sport's long history.